Well, the title for today comes from a book that's been around for a while now. It's called The Places That Scare You, A Guide to Fearlessness in Difficult Times. It was written by a Tibetan Buddhist, I guess they call them nuns in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Pema Chodron. A Guide to Fearlessness in Difficult Times seemed like a pretty good title considering our day and age. You know, a lot of people come to a spiritual path, either Buddhism or unity, and they think it's going to solve all their problems and make their fear go away. And instead, what usually happens is that we continue to come nose to nose with our deepest fears and insecurities. Darn it. And instead of learning how to abide with those things and use our practice to get through them, often what people do is they abandon the path and go looking for the next thing. You know the old saying, right? When the going gets tough, give up. or move on to the next shiny new object. Because if it doesn't feel good all the time, there must be something wrong with it. So what this book is trying to show us is that you can't dispel anxiety and fear and uncertainty by trying to avoid the places that scare us. It's a paradox. To be fearless means that we're willing to enter into the places that scare us. Fearless doesn't mean no fear. It means we don't let the fear stop us. We master the fear instead of the other way around. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about how the Bible can still be relevant, especially if we choose to treat it as myth and metaphor. And that was something that Kelly's opening song was talking about, ancient stories, right? These ancient stories can be instructive. They contain wisdom. And one of the stories I want to talk about today is from the Gospel of Mark. It's the one about Jesus and his disciples coming face to face with a very scary situation and how they dealt with it. They were all together on a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee. And this great windstorm arises and the waves start coming over the side of the boat and the boat is in danger of being swamped. But apparently Jesus didn't think it was a big deal. Either that or he was just dead tired. Either way, he was sound asleep on a cushion in the very back of the boat. And in the meantime, the disciples were starting to lose their cool. Now, what's really interesting about these stories, and this is a pretty short story, and what we learned in ministerial school is that if a story seems too short, add to it. Make something up. Because you can always read between the lines of these stories and help to fill things out a little bit. They leave parts out, or we need to know more information, so we get a little bit creative. We get to fill in the blanks. So, let's think about one of the things that we definitely know about the disciples from all the other stories in the Gospels. What we know is that they were professional fishermen, right? They owned boats. They were experienced sailors. You know, these weren't a bunch of landlubbers renting a houseboat for the weekend. These guys knew what they were doing. So the story says that the waves were coming over the sides into the boat. The boat was starting to fill up. They were close to being swamped. Now I ask you, what would an experienced sailor be doing if water was coming over the side and filling the boat? Get the buckets and start bailing like crazy and maybe, change course and head for shore, right? That makes sense. But here's what probably happened. The story doesn't tell us this, but this is what probably happened, okay? So you got Peter. And we figure, from everything we know about him in the other stories, that he had to be the captain. He was the leader, so he was the captain, right? And as the wind starts to blow harder, someone says, "Yo, Peter, there's water coming into the boat." And Peter says, "Yeah, no big deal. I've seen worse. Go wake some guys up, get the buckets, and start bailing." A couple of beats later, the same voice comes back and says, "Yo, Peter, where's the buckets at?" Peter says, "How should I know? James was supposed to load the boat. Go ask him." In the meantime, the waves are getting higher. Water's coming into the boat. James says, "Don't look at me. John was supposed to get the buckets today." And John says, "Hey, I told Judas to do it." And Judas says, "Don't." They could have thrown him overboard right there probably and saved a lot of trouble later on, but There it is. Who else? Judas forgot the buckets. They're in a dangerous situation. They've just made it worse because they weren't ready for it. Judas forgot the buckets. So now panic starts to set in. And haven't we all done similar things in our lives on occasion? Have we ever made a bad decision that made a bad situation worse, or made a bad situation worse because we weren't prepared? The disciples got complacent. Maybe someone should have had a checklist, right? That might have solved the problem. So that's the first part of the story, lack of preparation, complacency. The second part is their panic, which is what's happening. And the third part of the story is drama and victimhood, because the disciples are thinking the end is near. I mean, it's hard to believe that sailors are panicking, but this must have been a really bad storm. They're thinking the end is near, and of course, guess what Jesus is doing? He's still sleeping. As far as Jesus is concerned, no buckets, no problem. You're the sailors after all. You'll figure something out, right? He's not worried. But the disciples are. They're actually close to freaking out. And so they start to make up stories about why Jesus is sleeping. And here's a quote that comes directly from the story, which says, "But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?'" Can you sense the drama and the victimhood there? Can you? He doesn't care about us. Nobody cares about us. Whatever will become of us, right? And the story says that, well, Jesus gets up and he rebuked the wind and the sea, and the storm stopped and the water became calm again. However, Jesus wasn't finished yet, because he still had some more rebuking to do. After things calm down, he turns on the disciples and says, "What are you so afraid of? Don't you have any faith?" Now, people of a more literal bent might look at this story as just another miracle story, showing that Jesus was so powerful that he could control the weather. But if that's all there is to the story, why did he give the disciples such a hard time for being afraid? You know, there's a lot more to this than controlling the weather and miracles. It's a lesson in self-reliance. The disciples asked Jesus to save them, to bail them out, literally. And like a good teacher, he does it, but he's not happy about it. He's not happy about it. He wanted them to have faith, which I translate as trust. Jesus had total trust in his guys, so much so that he could stay asleep and relax. What he wanted most of all was for them to trust themselves. Jesus trusted them, but the disciples, not so much. They gave up on themselves. They let a bad situation get worse, and then they give in to panic and fear to the extent where, well, they froze, right? That's what happens. You freeze. You're incapable of taking creative action in response to this problem. So what does Jesus do with it? He uses it as a teachable moment. I remember back in my flying days when I was working on getting my instrument rating, and back in Illinois, we had a lot of very clear and sunny days, really, nothing like out here in California, but it really wasn't too often that you actually got to go up and fly into the clouds or above the clouds and practice in actual instrument conditions. So what we would do is we would, on this next picture, we would put a visor on like this. You put this thing on that covers your face so that you can only see the instrument panel. If you want to look outside, you have to pick your head up like that, and of course the instructor will tell you you're cheating. So the idea is you can only see the instruments, and it's called going under the hood as a way to simulate instrument flying conditions. And every now and then, the instructor would tell you, even under the hood, he'd tell you to close your eyes. And what he would do is he would take the airplane and put it through a whole bunch of different maneuvers. He'd get it off course, he'd get you totally disoriented, and put the plane in a potentially dangerous attitude, and then he would tell you to open your eyes and take the controls back. You would have to look only at the instruments and try to figure out if you were still flying safely and on course. Is the nose pointed up? Can't look outside. Is it pointed down? Are you in a dive? Are you spiraling? What's going on? And then put the plane back into safe level flight. And sometimes, to make things really interesting, he'd take a big old Post-it note and cover up one of the instruments that you're counting on, right? So you'd have to go through your backup procedures. And you always knew that the instructor was there to back you up, take the controls if you really messed up. But there was still a significant, pucker factor in going through one of these exercises. And there was also an element of pride involved, and really healthy pride, because you really didn't want the instructor, your teacher, to have to take over, because this was a test of your skills and your preparation. And you knew that the instructor was going to push you to the very edge of your resourcefulness, which is what a good teacher does. It's what life does. And life is a good teacher, right? Because it constantly pushes us to the edge of our resourcefulness. Sometimes you have a safety pilot, someone there to catch you when you fall, and sometimes we're on our own. Now, in our gospel story, the disciples picked the perfect day to forget the buckets, right? They dodged a bullet. They got lucky. They didn't have to pay the ultimate price for their lack of preparation or for giving in to fear and panic. So in the book, The Places That Scare You, the author says this, that the essence of bravery is being without self-deception. However, it's not so easy to take a straight look at what we do. Seeing ourselves clearly is initially uncomfortable and embarrassing. It's another reason sometimes why people abandon the spiritual path, because of the level of self-awareness that's required. Self-awareness is scary, uncomfortable. Sometimes we are like experienced sailors who forget the buckets, and it's not always easy to admit that or look at it when it happens. So Jesus, the great teacher, invited his students to take a closer look at themselves. What went wrong here? What habitual patterns of mind might have led to that fear and panic that left you so paralyzed? What might you do to begin to take responsibility for the direction of your life? I suppose one response would be, never get in a boat again. That's not exactly a good thing for a fisherman. But that's one of the ways we react to the places that scare us, avoidance. For a fisherman, not an option. In fact, it's not an option really for anyone who wants to fully experience this gift of life. If we keep trying to avoid the places that scare us, we end up retreating to and then confining ourselves to some very small and uninteresting places. What we create is an illusion. It's an illusion of a safe cocoon that's actually a prison. Now, that's the extreme version of self-deception, and it gradually becomes, as the Buddhists say, they talk about it as being like a poison. It can choke the joy out of life. Pema Chodron says we always have a choice, and here's the choice. We can let the circumstances of our lives harden us and make us increasingly resentful and afraid, or we can let them soften us and make us kinder. I know what I want to choose. So maybe instead of throwing Judas overboard because he forgot the buckets, maybe we need to consider if we've ever done something like that, and maybe how we might have backed him up and double-checked safety equipment and things like that. I don't know, there's all sorts of options, always choices we can make. You know, in the book of Genesis, another ancient story, Cain and Abel, Cain is quoted as asking the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The answer that Jesus would give is a resounding yes. And that's especially true now because just like the disciples, we are all in the same boat, literally and metaphorically. We don't want to create danger in our lives, and we don't want to delude ourselves into thinking that we can avoid the places that scare us. We'll find them, they'll find us, And the key is to be prepared and to learn to start seeing those places as offering opportunities to do those very scary things, practicing self-awareness, but also practicing compassion and trust. See you next time.